Oh, good to go. And so I was just going to say thank you very much for inviting me here today to speak to you. I think the one positive thing to come out of this horrendous pandemic is the increased use of virtual platforms like this to share knowledge and support each other. It's something I wouldn't ever have thought about doing prior to this pandemic, but I found it really useful professionally and personally, and I hope that what I can share with you today will be useful to you as well. Over the next few months, I think it's going to be every Tuesday at this time. I'm going to be covering 6 sessions like this, covering all areas of child development, of motor development rather. So today, starting off, probably looking at head control, working right through to walking. Movement doesn't develop in isolation. All movements sort of overlap with each other, so feel free to dip in and out of any of these sessions. I'm going to do a little bit of theory as well as practical advice, so hopefully you'll be able to take some information from all of these sessions. With regard to questions, because I'm doing the theory at the start, I'll probably take a natural break then, and any questions you have, would that be an appropriate time, Jenny, for questions to be asked? Yeah. And then at the end, after the practical session, or feel free to bob in along the practical session with any questions you have, that's fine. Obviously, if you're tuned in today, then your child has a diagnosis of infantile spasms. Now, for me as a physio, that's quite an umbrella term, because I've never met your children and never handled them. I don't know exactly what is causing a difficulty with their motor development, but hopefully the information I can give today, I'll try and cover all areas of movement disorders, but hopefully you will still find that useful and beneficial. So yes, we're going to start today looking at foundations of movement. So we're going to look at what we need to be able to learn movement, and also how that movement is learned. And I find child development absolutely fascinating, but then I would, because that's my job. But I also feel quite passionately that it's really important to empower parents whose children I'm offering advice to with the knowledge of why I'm asking them to do a certain activity. Unless you really know the sort of theory behind what you're doing, it doesn't make so much sense. And I think it makes it much more purposeful and far more effective means of treatment. So I'm hoping that I can give you that information today. And also to say that physio, I don't like to see physio as a chore, which has to be sort of fitted into 15 minutes at the end of every day. If you have an awareness of what is helpful for your child's motor development, I hope that every time you interact with your child, so every time you are you're playing, you're feeding, you're changing, whatever you're doing with your child, at the back of your mind you've got an awareness of what you can do to help their motor development, so it can be incorporated to everything you do. So it's not that sort of 15 minutes of, oh, we're going to do physio, it's everything you're doing. So I hope that will be the key information really from what I'm going to tell you. So I don't want to baffle you with research and science, but I do want to try and explain how movement is learned. And just thinking about it, I think there are 5 key elements that you need for movement. I have written them down here. I had to do kind of mirror writing because you won't be able to see it back to front. I hope you can see that all right. So the 5 main elements are strength, stability, flexibility, coordination, and purpose. And I'll go through each of those, but if you've got those in mind, I think it's quite helpful to understand what you need for movement. So we start off with the first one, which is strength. So strength in our bodies is our muscles. They're the power units which move our arms, move our legs. So I've got biceps muscle here, which is a big power unit, which when it contracts, it bends my forearm up and flexes my elbow. So that's the big power unit that creates strength. In my leg, I've got my quadriceps muscle. When I contract my quadriceps muscle, my leg extends. So that is giving me strength. It's the power units are the muscles in our body that have strength to allow us to move. So that is the first one. We all need strength. The second one, stability. Now, for me, stability is the most important when we're looking at how children develop movement. If I use the analogy of, I've got a glass of water here, of picking up a glass of water. Okay, so we might just think, oh, that's just reaching out and holding that glass of water and using my muscles to bring it to my mouth. Actually, the most important part of that movement is stability. I need stability in my trunk to be able to sit on the floor. I need stability at my shoulder to allow my arm to lift up. I need stability in my elbow to allow my forearm to extend. I need stability in my wrist so that I can open my fingers and that I can hold that glass. There is so much stability involved in movement. And a lot of children who have a diagnosis of infantile spasms do have difficulty with stability, and that can be one of the key elements that is difficult with learning movement. So stability is really key. The third one was flexibility. So again, if I'm reaching out for that glass of water, I need the range of movements in all these joints to be able to carry out that function. So I need to have flexion at my shoulder, I need to be able to have extension at my elbow, I need to have extension at my wrist, I need to be able to open my fingers fully to be able to reach that glass. So if I have what we call contractures or tightness in my joints and I can't lift my arm up, I can't straighten my elbow, I can't extend my wrist or open my fingers, I'm not going to reach that glass of water. So again, we need flexibility. So we need strength in the muscles, stability at the joints, flexibility. And the fourth one is coordination. Now, coordination is the biggie. For me to learn how to reach out and lift that glass of water is a highly complex skill to learn from scratch. There's obviously lots of sensory information involved. So that's information coming to me from my experiences with the outside world. So I'm using my vision to look. I'm using my sense of touch to feel the glass. I need to have an awareness of where my body is in space, where my elbow is in space. There's also very complex pathways being developed to learn how far I need to reach, which muscles need to contract and which relax as I reach for something, how strong I need to be to actually grasp that glass without dropping it or breaking it. Also considering speed. If I pick that up really quickly, then I'm going to throw the water all over me. So coordination is a massive subject, which I can't even begin to cover today. But just to be aware that obviously learning that movement, when children learn movements, we have to think about coordination, which comes from all sorts of different pathways. But we need to be aware of that. And the last one is purpose, which is for children, I think, really important. If we're trying to teach a child a new motor task, there has to be purpose to it. A child isn't going to do anything if there's no reward. So for children learning movement, that's through play. A baby will learn to reach a toy because they want to reach that toy. That toy is stimulating. I want to reach that glass of water because I'm thirsty. That's why I'm doing that function. But for children, we need to make it purposeful. And the key to learning movement is repetition. That is vitally important. In normal child development, babies will repeat a movement over and over and over again until they perfect it. And they're doing that because they want to achieve. So if we're working with a child on a specific movement, we've got to make it purposeful. So in my view, if you think about those 5 key elements when we're working on a movement, that will give you an idea of all the things that are involved in a movement. And as a physio, when I'm looking at a child who has a difficulty with movement, I'm trying to figure out which sort of piece of that jigsaw puzzle is missing, and which is making it hard for them to learn a movement. And then we provide help, and that's what you guys do with your children to help them achieve that motor task by fitting in that missing piece of the puzzle. So that's just a kind of very brief overview of how movement is learned. So a baby who is born at full term with no movement disorder at all has quite a few tricks up their sleeve in order to be able to learn movement. And sometimes babies with infantile spasms have a few of those tricks missing. And it's our job to identify what those are and support them so they can learn movement. So I think it's really helpful to know what some of those tricks are that babies are born with, which help them, so that we can see how we can help our children with movement. So the first one I'm just going to talk about is something called physiological flexion. I don't know whether anybody has ever heard about that. But basically, when a full-term baby is born, they don't, and they're laid on a surface, they don't just flop out and flop onto that surface flat as a pancake. They actually curl themselves into a little ball. So I've just got a picture here just to remind everybody of what a little newborn baby looks like. So you can see that little baby is really quite flexed and tucked up. And that is how newborn babies at term without movement disorders tend to lie. That is their posture. So this is because at fab. Thank you for that comment. We can really work with that, and there's lots of things I can help you, so that's brilliant. So yes, with that physiological flexion, this movement is because in the womb, if a baby is born at full term and has normal postural tone, they would have been practicing movements within the uterus. So you would have felt those little punches and kicks against the womb. And as those punches and kicks come out, fortunately, they will naturally be brought back in again. And the child learns that when they're practicing their strength and their movement, they will always come back into that flex position again. So they're learning that strength. And also as they become bigger, they get squashed. So sometimes babies who are born early, who haven't filled up the womb and haven't been squashed, are born being quite floppy and don't have this physiological flexion. And also babies who have some abnormal muscle tone, maybe a little bit floppy, don't have that physiological flexion either. And interestingly, with the newborn baby who has a physiological flexion, if you pull the baby's arm out and straighten the arm out, it will naturally just spring back in again. Again, with the leg, if you pull the baby's leg out, it will spring back again. And this physiological flexion actually provides a baby with stability. So as we were saying, you need stability to learn movement. So if children are born without that physiological flexion and are a little bit flatter, they're lacking in that stability. And you can see that's a really important missing piece of our picture. And interestingly, babies as well don't have that flexibility. They don't have full range of movement. So babies actually have quite tight elbows, and they have quite tight hips and tight knees. And so they don't have the flexibility older children have. So again, that really helps with their stability and helps them learn movement. So yes, physiological flexion is really important. And if it's not there, as you said, no, I hadn't got that when he was born, then you can see how it's going to be difficult for him to learn that movement to start with. So yeah, thank you for that comment. So another little trick babies have in their bag is their reflexes. You've probably all heard about baby reflexes, newborn reflexes. These are primitive survival instincts that are there, but many children with infantile spasms, normally these reflexes sort of integrate into normal movement patterns as the children get stronger and bigger and are able to isolate movements themselves. But sometimes these reflexes persist and they can actually be then detrimental to movement. So it's quite interesting to look at some of the reflexes that can be a problem to movement development, because you might identify those in your child and you can do things to help them. So one of the reflexes you've probably heard of is the startle reflex, the Moro reflex. So that's in response, so a newborn baby in response to a loud noise or a sudden movement in their head backwards, their limbs, both upper and lower limbs, will spring out and then they will come back in again. And that's a protective reflex that babies have, and that's why they have it to start with, but that does integrate quite early on. But if your child remains very sensitive to sudden noises, that can cause a real difficulty with learning movement, because they might be trying to learn a movement, trying to practice something, and then there's a loud noise and suddenly your arms and legs spring out and back in. That's really going to make things difficult for you. So that's a really important consideration with that startle reflex. There's other reflexes. There's the palmar grasp reflex. You probably know with newborn babies, if you stimulate their palm, they will hold on to your finger, which seems very nice, but eventually they will learn how to let go, and that's a nice reflex. That's how children learn to grab hold of toys and learn grasp, and it's very useful. But if that reflex doesn't disappear, doesn't integrate, and you learn to be able to release, that can be really difficult. So every time your child's palm is stimulated, they're grasping and they can't let go, so they're doing that fisting, then that can be difficult, because you need open hands for so many motor tasks. So that's another one to be aware of, that can be quite difficult if it doesn't integrate. Similarly, on the foot, if you stimulate the ball of the foot, toes curl and you can get pointing of the foot. So if whenever your foot touches the floor, your toes are curling and you also get a bit of increased tone, that can be really difficult when you're first looking at standing or stepping, one to be aware of. A slightly more complicated one, I don't know whether people have heard of the ATNR, which is the asymmetric tonic neck reflex. So that happens when the baby looks to if head turns to one side, the arm and leg on that side will extend, and the arm and leg on the opposite side will flex up. So it will, work the other way. So if the baby's head turns that way, their arm will extend, but this side will flex up. So to start with, that's really useful for developing hand-eye coordination, because if babies are reaching, their visual field is going towards where their hand is, and it's really good for hand-eye coordination. But if that movement isn't integrated, so every time as the child gets bigger, that when their head turns, this happens, it can really make it difficult to learn new movements if that's going to happen every time. And one of the things is rolling. If the baby's trying to roll, but every time they do that, this arm is being pulled back, you'll find that babies need quite a bit of help to bring that arm over to get that roll. So the ATNR, which you may or may not have heard of, is a reflex which can be useful to start with, but again, if it doesn't integrate, it's good to be aware of, because there are things we can do to help integrate that reflex. So those are the main reflexes that interfere with movement, but they are there in a newborn baby to help develop movement, but you can see how they can be a problem if they're not going to integrate. And the last thing I'm going to talk about with regards to the tricks in the bag, tricks up the sleeve, is postural tone. Now, if you've got a child with infantile spasms, you've probably heard people talk about their postural tone. Babies can have increased tone or decreased tone, or they can have fluctuating tone, so it jumps between the two. Postural tone is something really quite difficult to explain. It isn't strength, it isn't how the muscle purely contracts on its own, it's how the body is able to maintain a position up against gravity. So if you have low postural tone, obviously there's a big scale, you can have mildly low or severely low postural tone, then anything up against gravity is going to be difficult for you. So if we're thinking of early movement, when children are lying on their back, being able to bring their arms or their head up against gravity is going to be really difficult, because anything against gravity is hard work. Sitting like this would be very difficult. You'd be very slumped. Obviously older children we're talking about, not babies. Opposite to that, you've got high tone, increased tone, and that's when muscles are working, or your tone generally are working, they're too excitable and they can get locked and stiff, and it's very difficult to coordinate movement. So you may have heard the term high tone, and obviously if you've got too much tone, too high a tone, then it's very difficult to learn that isolated movement. So any abnormalities in tone can make things difficult as well. So what we're going to look at today at a more practical point of view is looking at head control. And this is one of the fundamental requirements of movement development. So we can think about early stages for head control, but also throughout the child's life, they have difficulties with postural tone, or all sorts of movement disorders. Then working on head control is key. So hopefully some of these techniques that we're going to use today, they're based around the younger child, but you can still use them with the older children as well. So before I go on to the practicalities of it, I've kind of whizzed through a load of theory, but I really hope that some of that information you can relate to your child, and it makes a bit of sense and you can understand where we're coming from as physios. So does anybody have any questions related to that theory side of things?